The construction of Viking ships represented one of the most sophisticated naval engineering achievements of the early medieval period, developing over centuries through careful observation and methodical refinement of woodworking techniques. The Viking longship emerged from the Scandinavian peninsula between the 8th and 11th centuries, evolving from earlier Germanic vessel designs that had been used for coastal navigation and river travel throughout northern Europe. The shipbuilding process began with the selection of appropriate timber, primarily oak for the hull planking and structural components, though pine and fir were sometimes used for masts and yards when oak was not readily available in sufficient quantities. The oak trees were chosen for their straight grain and natural curvature, with shipbuilders seeking trees that had grown in dense forests, where competition for sunlight produced tall, straight trunks with minimal branching. The felling of trees occurred during the winter months when the sap content was lowest, reducing the likelihood of warping and cracking as the wood dried over the following seasons. Each tree was carefully examined before cutting, with the shipbuilder assessing the grain pattern and natural shape to determine which parts of the trunk would be suitable for specific components of the vessel. The preparation of timber required extensive labor and specialized tools that had been passed down through generations of Norse craftsmen. The felled trees were transported to the shipyard using sledges during winter when the frozen ground facilitated movement of heavy logs across the landscape. At the shipyard, the logs were stored under shelter to protect them from direct sunlight and rain while they seasoned for approximately 1 to 2 years before being worked into ship components. The seasoning process allowed the wood to reach an equilibrium moisture content that would minimize dimensional changes once the ship was completed and launched into the water. The shipbuilder used axes, adzes, and drawknives to shape the timber, with each tool serving a specific purpose in the transformation of rough logs into precisely fitted planks and frames. The iron tools were forged by local blacksmiths who understood the specific requirements of shipbuilding, producing blades that could be sharpened to maintain a keen edge through hours of continuous work. The workshop itself was typically located near the shoreline where the completed vessel could be launched directly into the water without requiring overland transport. The construction sequence began with the keel, which formed the backbone of the entire vessel and determined its overall length and structural integrity. The keel was typically cut from a single piece of oak, measuring between 15 and 30 meters in length depending on the intended size and purpose of the ship. Warships designed for raiding and naval combat tended toward the longer end of this range, while cargo vessels and smaller fishing boats were constructed with shorter keels that provided greater stability for carrying heavy loads. The keel was laid on a series of supporting blocks that held it at the proper height above the ground, while allowing the shipbuilders to work underneath and around it from all sides. Once the keel was positioned, the stem and stern post were attached at each end. These curved pieces of timber being carefully shaped to create the characteristic swept-up profile that gave Viking ships their distinctive appearance. The stem and stern posts were joined to the keel using iron nails and wooden tree nails, with the joints sealed using a mixture of tar and animal hair to prevent water infiltration. The hull planking was applied using the clinker or lapstrake method, in which each plank overlapped the one below it by approximately 20 to 30 millimeters along its entire length. This overlapping construction created a flexible hull that could absorb the impact of waves without cracking or leaking, an essential feature for vessels that would navigate the rough waters of the North Atlantic and the Baltic Sea. The planks were typically 20 to 25 millimeters thick and varied in width from 15 to 30 centimeters, depending on their position in the hull. Each plank was carefully shaped to follow the curve of the hull, with the shipbuilder using patterns and templates to ensure consistent dimensions throughout the vessel. The planks were fastened to each other using iron rivets that were driven through pre-drilled holes and clenched over on the inside of the hull, creating a permanent mechanical connection that would not loosen over time. Between each overlapping plank, a strip of wool or animal hair soaked in tar was inserted to create a watertight seal that would remain flexible even as the wood expanded and contracted with changes in moisture content. The internal framing of the ship consisted of ribs or frames that were spaced at regular intervals along the length of the hull, typically every 60 to 80 centimeters depending on the size of the vessel. These frames were not attached to the keel directly, but were instead fitted against the inside of the planking and secured using wooden tree nails that passed through the planks and into the frame ends. This construction method allowed the hull to flex independently of the framing, distributing stress throughout the structure rather than concentrating it at specific connection points. The frames were naturally curved pieces of timber harvested from the junctions where large branches met the trunk of oak trees, these natural crooks providing the necessary shape without requiring extensive steaming or bending. The use of naturally curved timber reduced the likelihood of grain interruption that could weaken the frames under load, and it minimized the amount of labor required to shape each component. The spacing of frames was carefully calculated to provide adequate support without adding unnecessary weight that would reduce the ship's speed and cargo capacity. The deck of the Viking ship was not a continuous solid surface, but rather consisted of removable planks that could be lifted to access the hold below for cargo loading and storage. These deck planks were laid across beams that spanned the width of the hull, resting on supports that were integrated into the frame structure. The removable nature of the deck allowed for maximum flexibility in cargo arrangement and facilitated cleaning and maintenance of the interior spaces. In the center of the ship, a mast step was constructed as a reinforced section of the keel that would support the weight of the mast and the forces generated by the sail. The mast itself was a single piece of pine or fir, typically ranging from 10 to 15 meters in height depending on the size of the vessel. The mast was stepped into the mast step and secured using a partner piece at deck level that prevented lateral movement, while allowing the mast to be lowered when necessary for passing under bridges or during storms. The sail was made from wool that had been woven into a tight fabric and treated with a mixture of tar and fat to make it more resistant to water and wind damage. The steering mechanism of the Viking ship consisted of a single oar mounted on the right side of the stern, this positioning being the origin of the term starboard for the right side of a vessel. The steering oar was attached to the hull using a leather strap or iron bracket that allowed it to pivot vertically and horizontally, giving the steersman precise control over the direction of the ship. The steersman stood on a raised platform at the stern where he could observe the water ahead and coordinate with the crew during navigation. The rowing positions were arranged along the sides of the ship, with oar ports cut through the planking at regular intervals to allow the oars to pass through when the ship was being propelled by human power. Each oar was approximately 5 to 6 meters in length, shaped from a single piece of ash wood that provided the necessary strength and flexibility for sustained rowing. The oarlocks were simple notches cut into the gunwale or removable wooden pieces that could be inserted when rowing was required and removed when the ship was under sail. The tools used in Viking shipbuilding were relatively simple but highly effective in the hands of skilled craftsmen who had learned their trade through years of apprenticeship and practice. The broad axe was used for flattening and smoothing large surfaces, while the adze was employed for hollowing and shaping curved components. The drawknife allowed for fine shaping of planks and trim pieces, and the auger was used for drilling holes for rivets and tree nails. All of these tools required regular maintenance and sharpening, with the shipbuilder spending considerable time each day keeping his equipment in optimal condition. The iron for the tools and the rivets was obtained through trade or local production, with Scandinavian iron ore being smelted in bloomery furnaces that produced a spongy mass of iron that required extensive forging to remove impurities. The quality of the iron varied considerably, and experienced shipbuilders learned to identify and work around imperfections that could compromise the strength of fastenings. The wood joinery techniques employed by Viking shipbuilders did not rely heavily on metal fastenings, with much of the structural integrity coming from the precise fitting of wooden components that were held together by friction and compression. The construction of a Viking ship required the coordinated effort of multiple craftsmen working together over a period of several months to complete a single vessel. The master shipbuilder directed the overall process, making decisions about dimensions, proportions, and the selection of materials for each component. Under his supervision, specialized workers focused on specific tasks such as plank shaping, frame fitting, rivet installation, and caulking. The division of labor allowed for efficient progress while maintaining the quality standards that had been established through generations of shipbuilding tradition. The shipyard itself was a busy place with multiple projects often underway simultaneously, each at different stages of completion. The sounds of axes striking wood, hammers, driving rivets, and saws cutting timber created a constant background noise that marked the passage of time in the coastal communities where shipbuilding was a central economic activity. The completion of a ship was celebrated with a launching ceremony that often included religious observances and feasting to honor the craftsmen and bless the vessel for its future voyages. The finished Viking ship was a vessel of remarkable seaworthiness, capable of crossing open ocean as well as navigating shallow rivers and beaches. The shallow draft of approximately 1 meter allowed the ships to be beached directly on shore without requiring port facilities, giving Viking raiders and traders the ability to land at virtually any point along a coastline. The combination of sail and oar power provided flexibility in propulsion, allowing the ships to make progress even when winds were unfavorable or when precise maneuvering was required in confined waters. The cargo capacity of a typical Viking longship ranged from 10 to 20 tons depending on its size, with larger cargo vessels capable of carrying substantially more. The crew complement varied according to the purpose of the voyage, with warships carrying 30 to 80 warriors while trading vessels operated with smaller crews of 10 to 20 sailors. The speed of a Viking ship under favorable conditions could reach 10 to 12 knots, making them among the fastest vessels of their time and allowing them to cover considerable distances in a single day of sailing. The maintenance of Viking ships required ongoing attention throughout their service life, with regular inspection and repair of hull planking, fastenings, and caulking being essential to seaworthiness. The ships were typically hauled ashore during the winter months when sailing was dangerous due to storms and reduced daylight, allowing for thorough inspection and repair of any damage sustained during the sailing season. The tar and pitch used for waterproofing required periodic reapplication, and the wooden components needed to be protected from rot through careful storage and ventilation. A well-maintained Viking ship could remain in service for 20 to 30 years, though many vessels had shorter operational lives due to damage from storms, combat, or grounding on rocky shores. The end of a ship's service life was sometimes marked by ritual burial, with several archaeological discoveries revealing Viking ships that had been interred with high-status individuals as part of funeral ceremonies. These burial ships provide valuable information about construction techniques and materials, as the anaerobic conditions of burial preserved wooden components that would otherwise have decayed. The legacy of Viking shipbuilding extended well beyond the Viking Age itself, with construction techniques and design principles influencing naval architecture throughout Northern Europe for centuries. The Clinker planking method continued to be used in traditional boat building in Scandinavia and the British Isles well into the modern era, and the basic hull form of the Viking longship can be seen in later medieval and Renaissance vessels. The navigational capabilities demonstrated by Viking sailors who reached North America centuries before Columbus testified to the seaworthiness of their ships and the skill of their builders. The archaeological record includes numerous Viking ship discoveries from the well-preserved Oseberg and Jurstad ships in Norway to the fragmentary remains found in harbor excavations throughout the Baltic region. Each discovery adds to the understanding of Viking shipbuilding techniques and the variations that existed between different regions and time periods within the Viking Age. The reconstruction of Viking ships using traditional methods has demonstrated the viability of the original designs, with modern replicas successfully completing ocean voyages that mirror the historical journeys of their ancestors. The process of Viking shipbuilding represented a sophisticated integration of material knowledge, structural engineering, and practical seafaring requirements that emerged from centuries of maritime tradition. The selection of materials, the shaping of components, and the assembly of the final vessel all reflected a deep understanding of wood behavior, water dynamics, and the demands of ocean navigation. The shipbuilders worked without written plans or detailed drawings, relying instead on mental templates and proportional systems that had been transmitted orally from master to apprentice over many generations. This oral tradition ensured the continuity of techniques while allowing for gradual refinement and adaptation to changing requirements and available materials. The investment of time and resources in ship construction reflected the central importance of maritime activity in Viking society, with ships serving as the primary means of transportation, trade, warfare, and exploration. The completion of each vessel represented not only a practical asset, but also a symbol of community wealth and technological capability that enhanced the status of its owner within the social hierarchy. The decline of Viking shipbuilding coincided with the end of the Viking Age and the integration of Scandinavian societies into the broader European political and economic system. The adoption of Christianity brought changes to burial practices that ended the tradition of ship burials, reducing the archaeological evidence available for study. The development of new ship types designed for different purposes gradually replaced the classic longship form, though many construction techniques persisted in modified forms. The knowledge of traditional Viking shipbuilding was preserved in remote coastal communities where old methods continued to be used long after they had been abandoned in more cosmopolitan centers. Modern interest in Viking history and maritime archaeology has led to renewed attention to these traditional techniques, with contemporary craftsmen working to preserve and demonstrate the skills of their medieval predecessors. The study of Viking ships continues to provide insights into medieval technology, trade networks, and the maritime capabilities that enabled the expansion of Norse influence across the North Atlantic world. The story of Viking shipbuilding is ultimately a story of human ingenuity applied to the challenges of maritime navigation using the materials and tools available in the medieval period. The ships were products of their environment, designed to meet the specific needs of Scandinavian seafarers who operated in waters that ranged from calm fjords to the open ocean. The construction methods reflected a practical approach to engineering that prioritized functionality and durability over ornamentation. Though many ships were decorated with carved figureheads and painted details that expressed the cultural values of their owners, the vessels served multiple roles throughout their service lives, transitioning from warships to trading vessels to fishing boats as the needs of their owners changed and the ships aged. The flexibility of the design allowed for modifications and repairs that extended the useful life of each vessel, maximizing the return on the considerable investment required for construction. The Viking ship remains an enduring symbol of the age that produced it, representing the maritime prowess and technical sophistication of a culture that left an indelible mark on European history through exploration, trade, and conquest. The construction process moved forward with steady rhythm, each step building upon the previous one in a logical sequence that had been refined through generations of practice. The shipbuilders worked from dawn until dusk during the sailing season, taking advantage of the long daylight hours of the Scandinavian summer to maximize progress on their projects. The winter months provided time for tool maintenance, material preparation, and planning for the construction season ahead. The shipyard community developed its own social structure, with master builders commanding respect and apprentices learning through observation and gradual assumption of responsibility. The transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next ensured that the essential techniques were preserved even as individual craftsmen added their own refinements and adaptations. The completion of each ship was both an individual achievement and a community accomplishment, reflecting the collective effort of many workers over many months. The launching of the vessel marked the transition from construction to operation, as the ship moved from the realm of the builder to the realm of the sailor who would guide it across the waters. The waves that would lap against the hull of the completed ship were the same waves that had challenged shipbuilders for centuries, testing every joint and seam for weakness. The design of the Viking ship acknowledged the power of the sea and worked with it rather than against it, creating vessels that could ride over waves rather than crash through them. The flexibility of the hull allowed it to absorb energy that would have broken more rigid constructions, and the overlapping planks created multiple barriers against water infiltration. The steering oar provided control that was responsive to the touch of the steersman, allowing for precise maneuvering in challenging conditions. The sail could be adjusted to capture wind from various angles, and it could be quickly lowered when conditions became too severe. The oars provided backup propulsion when the wind failed or when maneuvering in confined spaces required power that was independent of weather conditions. All of these features worked together to create a vessel that was greater than the sum of its parts, a testament to the accumulated knowledge of generations of shipbuilders who had learned from both success and failure. The harbor where the completed ship would dock was a place of constant activity, with vessels arriving and departing on the tides and traders exchanging goods from distant lands. The Viking ship was the vehicle that made this commerce possible, connecting communities that were separated by water and enabling the flow of goods, ideas, and people across the North Atlantic world. The ship carried not only cargo but also culture, spreading Norse influence to lands that had previously been beyond the reach of Scandinavian sailors. The construction of each ship represented an investment in this network of connections, a commitment to the maritime way of life that defined Viking society. The shipbuilders who created these vessels understood their role in this larger system, taking pride in the knowledge that their work would enable voyages that might span thousands of kilometers and last for many months. The legacy of their craftsmanship would endure in the ships that sailed long after the builders themselves had passed from this world, their names forgotten, but their work continuing to serve the needs of those who came after them. The silence of the shipyard at night was broken only by the sound of water lapping against the hulls of completed vessels waiting for the morning tide. The tools rested where they had been left, their wooden handles smooth from years of use, their iron blades sharp and ready for the work ahead. The timber stacks stood under their protective coverings, seasoned and prepared for transformation into ships that would carry the next generation of sailors across the seas. The shipbuilders slept in their homes nearby, their dreams perhaps filled with the curves of hulls and the patterns of planking that occupied their waking hours. The cycle of construction continued with the seasons, each year bringing new ships to replace those that had been lost or worn beyond repair. The knowledge passed from father to son, from master to apprentice, ensuring that the skills would survive even as individual craftsmen aged and retired. The sea waited patiently for the next vessel to launch, its waves rolling in with the same rhythm that had greeted Viking ships for centuries. The shipyard was a place of creation and continuity, where the past informed the present and the work of today would enable the voyages of tomorrow. The ships would sail, the traders would exchange their goods, the warriors would seek their glory, and the builders would continue their craft, each playing their part in the maritime world that the Vikings had created. The story of the ship was the story of the people who built it and sailed it, a tale of human ambition and technical achievement written in wood and iron on the surface of the sea.